Hello and welcome to Cogito Design. Before we get started on our next video today, I'm going to tell you about a giveaway that we are running. We have one copy of Philosophy: A Dare to Be Wise to give away to one lucky winner. If you would like to join, then please watch this video, and at the end I will tell you how you can be in for a chance to win. So enjoy and good luck! Worker placement has been one of the most important game design developments of the last 30 years. At the time of writing, there are 2,863 games on the Board Game Geek website listed as possessing this mechanic. And it would be an understatement to say worker placement is very well loved by the hobby gaming community. So what is this wonderful mechanic? Where did it come from and why do people love it so much? Let's take a look. Firstly, we need to establish what we mean by the term worker placement, and this isn't actually as easy as it sounds, so let's start with an example. In the game Everdell, on your turn you have 3 potential actions, one of which is to place a worker into one of these available locations, each of which correspond with a different action in the game. Place a worker here, and thematically this little hedgehog is performing this job to get you a pebble, and apparently pebbles are a crucial building material. Once you're here, the spot is exclusively occupied until your hedgehog is removed. So is that what worker placement is? Well, yes and no really. Everdell is certainly an example of the mechanic, but the problem is that worker placement is very flexible. It has been adapted and innovated upon so many times that any one clear definition will inevitably have several counterexamples. Take Carcassonne. In the game, you possess a finite amount of meeples, or workers, and you place them onto tiles to get a specific benefit. Yet very few would consider Carcassonne to be a worker placement game. The fact that these placements gain you endgame points rather than specific actions is a large part of what is missing here. But this example goes some way to show the difficulty that exists in definitively narrowing down what exactly worker placement is and is not. The most useful definition of the term may be to say that worker placement games will all have some combination, but not necessarily all of the following elements. 1. Have some form of action selection mechanic, indicated by placing a token in a specific location. 2. The workers are often placed in a common area, and so the actions they work for are available to all players. There is therefore often the ability to block these communal actions from other players. 3. The workers themselves will most likely be humans, or at least anthropomorphized into something similar like our turtle and hedgehog friends we met earlier. 4. The actions are usually thematically representative of work, as in a character is doing something to get something. 5. The workers you use are most often privately owned. 6. The gameplay is nearly always turn-based rather than simultaneous. And lastly, 7. The number of workers you have is finite, although often this number can be increased by in-game actions. If you see around 3 or 4 of these aspects in a game, then chances are you are playing a worker placement game. But as mentioned, there are certainly counterexamples to all of these. This blurred definition makes it also hard to determine the exact origins of the mechanic. Indeed, as the excellent podcast Ludology points out, the mechanic may be better thought of as one that evolves slowly, rather than one that appeared overnight in a specific game. Sort of the opposite to deck building games, which are generally thought to have been pioneered by the arrival of the game Dominion. But that's a mechanic for another video. That proviso being made, whilst we may be in a chicken and egg situation here, we can certainly look into some of the important moments in the creation and development of this remarkable mechanic to get more of an idea of its history. Silverton in 1991 may very well be the first game that could seriously be called worker placement. Silverton is a heavily complex game of railroads and mining, with worker placement certainly not being the only thing going on here. However, in the second phase of play, you place your 2 types of workers, surveyors and prospectors, down onto the communal board, and in future phases, players can then pay to gain specific benefits in the areas where these workers were placed. This does seem to have the whiff of worker placement. The game that most regard as the true beginning of the mechanic is Kingdom. There were actually only 300 copies of this game initially produced for the Essen Game Conference in 1998, but these sold out so quickly that the rights to the game were bought up and the game was eventually re-implemented as Aladdin's Dragons in the year 2000. Kingdom and Aladdin's Dragons involve players placing numbered counters down onto areas of a communal board. The different locations on the board represent different actions and benefits to the players. At the end of the round, these tokens are flipped and the player with the highest counter total gets to take the action. This is certainly very close to what we think of as worker placement. Indeed, Kingdom designer Richard Breese understandably claims the accolade of creating the first worker placement game, saying this in an interview with Tabletop Together.
The worker placement idea in Kingdom originated from playing Klaus Teuber's seminal game Settlers of Catan. I enjoyed Settlers, but was not over fond of the luck factor inherent in the dice rolling. I wanted to achieve the same effect but without the dice, just by direct placement of workers on the board. This became the central mechanic to Kingdom, and the first worker placement game.
Shortly after Kingdom, we saw Bus in 1999 and Way Out West in 2000, and a few other worker placement-y games, but the next major event in the life of the mechanic came in 2005 with the game Caelus. This indeed was very probably the game that coined the term worker placement, and whilst it wasn't the first time people had seen the mechanic, the success of this game led hobbyists to need a term for this new mechanic, and made designers really start to take notice. Following the success of Caelus, we saw the legendary Uwe Rosenberg create his seminal work Agricola in 2007, and this was shortly followed by Bernd Brunhofer's Stone Age in 2008. These games were both hugely successful and influential, and suddenly worker placement was everywhere. In 2011, Alien Frontiers raised $14,885 on Kickstarter. This may not seem much by today's standards, but it's recognised as one of the earliest board game successes on the platform, and at its core, you guessed it, worker placement. From this point forwards, the floodgates were truly opened. In the last decade, we've seen well over 2,000 more published games claiming the mechanic as their own, and there is no sign of this deluge abating. So what is it about this particular mechanic that is so appealing to players? As with most questions we ask on this channel, there are several answers. Firstly, the mechanic itself is relatively simple, and it's easy to connect to a theme. Worker placement involves placing objects into a particular space and taking a relevant action. Many tabletop games have themes which require you to oversee workers of some kind, and placing them into specific sections of a board for specific jobs fits neatly with the resource management goals of many modern board games. In fact, the frequency of use of this mechanic is itself a bonus. Hobby gamers are very likely to have seen a variation of the mechanic before, and so it will feel familiar and make the process of learning the game much easier. This reuse of mechanics is a great option for designers who want to embed complexity whilst minimising the time it takes to learn a game, but I think a full discussion on that idea belongs to another video. Another benefit of worker placement is that it gives a clear agency and choice to players with minimal or possibly even zero need for randomness. Indeed, as we saw earlier, this was a key part of Richard Breese's interest in creating the mechanic. It cannot be stated too often that interesting choices are a crucial part of game design, and with worker placement you can provide these with relative ease. For example, take Viticulture Essential Edition. Should I place a worker here to rent out a field for more money, take my chances on getting a season card, buy some new vines, or build up the infrastructure of my vineyard? Each of these distinct choices in viticulture involves just the board and a single worker, and each is a viable and desirable option. It's true that these possibilities may be limited by the workers of other players blocking off options, but actually this brings us to another benefit of the mechanic. Worker placement games which allow for blocking also allow for player interaction. Many worker placement games have communal action spaces, and these are very often blockable by the workers of other players. Indeed, Jamey Stegmaier, one of the creators of Viticulture, argues that if the worker actions are not in some way communal, then he would not consider the game to be a worker placement game at all. Whether you hold this view or not, games that do have this aspect allow for a deep and interesting level of player interaction, but without that interaction being directly negative in the way that the take that mechanic is. You are strategically interested in what your opponent does on their turn, but you do not feel personally attacked by these decisions. Last, but certainly not least, it is clear that this mechanic has an incredible inherent flexibility to it. It seems like designers can twist, change and remix the mechanic in an endless series of ways. It is this flexibility that is the root of why the mechanic is so difficult to define. It is at home in relatively light games like Lords of Waterdeep, as much as it is in the deeply complex games of Tricarion and Anachrony. The mechanic is robust enough to retain its magic throughout the countless twists and tweaks that designers have subjected it to. To demonstrate this diversity within the mechanic, we should look at some of the most interesting twists that have been added to this base. Agricola is interesting as it adds the need for upkeep to your workers, so the more you have, the more you need to feed them. Tzolk'in uses these fabulous gears to create something really unique with the mechanic. The workers you place move around an axis as the game progresses, with the action they can perform getting more and more powerful over time. So you are left with this interesting conundrum of whether you leave them on the gears for longer to get a better benefit, or take them back early to get more available workers. Raiders of the North Sea and its follow-up Raiders of Scythia make the workers themselves communal to all players and allow you to take two actions. One when you place a worker and a second when you pick a replacement worker back up. The Raiders games also have the interesting aspect of allowing more than one type of worker into the fray. Something we see in several worker placement games like Caverna, Uwe Rosenberg's follow-up to Agricola, which allows you to level up your workers for harder tasks. The fantastic games Orleans and its follow-up Altiplano have connected together aspects of deck building and worker placement to create something that is very probably a new mechanic in its own right. Players draw workers randomly from a bag each round and place them onto jobs on their own private player board. These actions allow them, among other things, to hire more workers to their bag and remove workers from their bag in the style of a classic deck builder. This mechanic also rather uniquely allows the placement of the workers to be done simultaneously, removing downtime from this process. Games like Marco Polo and Rajas of the Ganges have removed the classic meeples and instead replaced them with dice, adding in a juicy element of input randomness to the agency of the worker placement. Robinson Crusoe manages to bring a version of the mechanic into a cooperative game. Many worker placement games like Way Out West and Viticulture allow you to purchase more workers during the course of the game. In the game Village, your workers can even get older and die. So there is much to like about this versatile mechanic, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. There are also some pitfalls to be aware of when designing with worker placement. The first issue stems from worker placement games being, for the most part, turn-based, non-simultaneous affairs, which allow for players to block off actions for other players. This inevitably means that the player that goes first has a clear advantage. There have been many possible solutions presented for this problem, however none are absolutely perfect. Many games like Tzolk'in simply give a bonus of extra currency, in this case corn, to players who go second, third and fourth. However, it's hard to see that this will lead to a perfect mathematically balanced game and feels a little more like a crutch. Some games like Agricola have made the ability to go first as a particular action you can take in the worker placement stage. This, however, provides the problem that other players are massively benefited or hindered merely from whether they are sat to the left or right of the player who takes this option. Viticulture solves this issue by having the choosing of the turn order be a worker placement phase itself, with bigger benefits for those choosing to go later in turn order. This is a satisfying solution, but still provides us with two problems. Firstly, the person going first in choosing the turn order still has the same first player advantage. And second, this can make the turn order become a little confusing in games with more players, as it is no longer a simple clockwise motion and can instead zigzag from player to player. That being said, most of these games run in phases, with the first player token moving around from player to player, so issues of a first player advantage are mitigated by the fact that each player will most likely get their turn to be that first player. Two other solutions to this issue are provided by games like Robinson Crusoe and Orléans. Robinson Crusoe is a cooperative game, and so a first player advantage is no longer relevant, as all players are progressing towards the same goal. As mentioned earlier, Orléans and its successor Altiplano make the actions simultaneous and limited to your own player board. There is no first player advantage here because there is no first player. A second potential pitfall of worker placement is in its simplicity. It could potentially become a little tedious in longer games if the mechanic is all that is on offer. Many games solve this issue by building in other mechanics to the game, one of the most successful additions being engine building. In Everdell, for example, you rely heavily on worker placement at the start of the game, but as you build up your engine, the cards become the focus of your play later in the game. A final potential issue with the mechanic is in its regular use of blocking. As we have mentioned, this provides an interesting and non-confrontational aspect of player interaction and an engaging tension to games, but on the downside, it also lowers players' choices and can be a little frustrating. Solutions to this issue include having worker placement areas which are unlimited and unblockable, such as those seen in Everdell. Game designer and blogger Patrick Engro sees this aspect of worker placement games as very important and draws a distinction between restrictive and limitless worker placement games that either allow for blocking or don't. Personally, I find games that explore a little of both options to be the most engaging. My favourite solution to this issue, however, is the Grande Worker from Viticulture. Each player receives just one of these little chubby workers, and they have the power to go anywhere, even onto the blocked spaces. This means that all the actions are available to players every round, but they can only guarantee to get one of them, so the possibilities and advantages of blocking remain. This Grande Worker keeps the tension and player interaction in the game, but loses the frustration of not being able to do the one thing that is absolutely crucial to your strategy. In conclusion, it may be hard to define, but worker placement is a terrific tool for any board game designer. It is a simple, fun, and well-known mechanic that easily generates interesting decisions. It fits snugly into the themes of many tabletop games and is flexible enough to allow for a seemingly endless amount of new and interesting innovations. It has been the core of some of the most successful games in the hobby, and hopefully designers will continue to utilise and innovate this remarkable mechanic well into the future. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe to this Cogito Design YouTube channel to help us bring more of these videos to you. Thank you so much, as always, to our patrons. We couldn't do this without you, so thank you so much for your support. And if you are liking our content so far, just like our patrons, then why not head to our Patreon page now? Before you do, I'm going to tell you how you can be in for a chance to win this copy of Philosophy: A Dare to Be Wise. To enter, all you have to do is follow this Cogito Design YouTube channel and then comment below this video telling us your favourite worker placement game. This giveaway will close on the 20th of October and the winner will be announced soon after. Good luck and see you next time. Bye!